predator becomes prey in the Florida Everglades as hundreds of hunters descend on the Sunshine State to catch and kill as many Burmese pythons as possible.
Days after the storm, cameras moved into Florida's swamps to record flood damage. What they found was not just mud, broken wood, and dead water. The footage showed signs of movement, strange lines cut through reeds, and objects carried far beyond where experts thought the flood could reach. At first, it looked like random ruin. Then the details began to connect. The first videos came from airboats, rescue teams, and local people who knew those swamps better than any map. They were not looking for a mystery. They were trying to see what the water had done, which roads were gone, and which homes near the marsh edge might still be standing. What they brought back seemed simple enough at first. Brown water, torn grass, trees bent low by wind. But then the footage slowed down. In one stretch of swamp, whole patches of reeds were pressed flat in one direction, then sharply turned in another, as if two different forces had moved through the same place hours apart. Nearby, floating debris was caught high in branches. Well above the level many locals said the water had reached. A child's cooler hung from a cypress limb. Part of a dock was wrapped around roots almost a mile from the nearest canal. None of it fit neatly. Field crews noticed something else. The swamp floor was not just covered. In places, it looked scraped. Long pale streaks ran through dark mud, too wide for animal trails, too smooth for normal flood wash. One drone operator marked 3 of these lines before losing signal over a stand of dead trees. He later said they looked less like damage and more like paths. That was the first break in the story, because if this was only storm aftermath, the wreckage should have followed known rules. Water rises, water spreads, water leaves a mark. But these marks did not match the maps used by county crews. They did not match the old flood models either. Something had pushed through the swamp with more force, and with more direction, than anyone first wanted to admit. And once investigators began to compare those first images side by side, one question moved to the center of everything. What, exactly, had traveled through that water after the storm passed? In Florida, swamps erase things fast. That is one of their oldest rules. Water moves in, mud settles, plants close over what was there before. Within days, sharp edges soften. Within weeks, whole sections can look untouched, even when they are not. That is why the footage troubled so many people who study flood land for a living. The swamp was not hiding the damage. In some places, it seemed to be displaying it. Small objects were found in open view, laid out in narrow bands, almost like markers. A fuel can, pieces of insulation, fishing gear, plastic bins with lids still locked on. They were not spread in a loose fan, the way storm water usually leaves debris when it slows down. They were grouped in strips. The same thing showed up again and again across separate areas. Then came the trees. Several stands of cypress showed bark stripped on only one side. Not all around. Not random. One face of the trunk was clean and pale, while the other still held moss and dark growth. That matters. It suggests force from a set direction, and not just rising water. In normal flooding, water lifts and carries. Here, something had also cut across. Local biologists noticed animal behavior had changed too. Birds that usually returned within a day stayed away. Gators was seen farther out on higher ground. Even insects seemed thinner near the channels, where the strange scrape lines appeared. The swamp was reacting as if its pattern had been broken, and buried inside those details was a harder truth. If the land was showing more than it should, then the flood had done more than cover ground. It had reshaped routes through it. That raised a question officials did not answer at first. Were these signs left by nature alone, or by infrastructure that failed out of sight? If you value deep investigations like this, consider subscribing. The deeper investigators looked, the less this seemed like random flood damage. One clue kept returning in the footage. It was the waterline itself. On homes near the marsh edge, the stain left by the flood was not level. It rose, dropped, then rose again across walls that should have shown a single mark. In storage sheds, muddy lines sat above shelves, then appeared lower on the back wall. as if the force of the water had changed inside the same small space. On fence posts, grass and trash were woven into the wire at two clear heights. That suggested more than one surge. At first, that did not sound unusual. Storms can pulse. Wind can push water in waves. But when survey teams compared marks from separate sites, a pattern emerged. The second line, the stranger one, often pointed back toward drainage cuts, canals, and control structures built to move water away from roads and neighborhoods. In plain terms, the flood did not only spread outward. In places, it seems to have been redirected. That matters in Florida more than almost anywhere else. Much of the land is managed by pumps, gates, levees, and channels. Water here is not fully wild. It is guided, blocked, released, and timed. When that system works, people barely notice it. When it fails, the land tells the story. And in this case, the land may have been telling two stories at once. One was the storm itself. The other was what happened after the storm pressure met a system already under strain. That could explain the hard angles in flattened reeds, the bands of debris, and the scrape marks through soft mud. Not one event, but a chain of them. Then one county worker said something that shifted the investigation again. Looking at the marks on a row of flooded buildings, he said the pattern resembled backflow. Not just water coming in, water returning from somewhere it was never meant to go. Long before formal reviews began, local people were already describing the same thing in almost the same words. They did not all know each other. Some lived near the marsh. Some worked on airboats. Some only passed through after the storm to check fences, traps, or old family land. Yet their accounts carried the same details. They spoke of a second push in the water. They spoke of a low sound before dawn, like pressure moving under the ground. They spoke of debris arriving late, after the worst wind had passed. That timing matters. In most storm stories, the strongest damage comes with the storm itself. Wind tears, water rises, then the slow work of cleanup begins. But here, several witnesses said the most confusing changes happened later. One man described checking a flooded path at sunset, then coming back the next morning to find the reeds bent the opposite way. A woman near a drainage cut said the water around her property had gone down during the night, only to return in a narrow, fast-moving sheet carrying pieces of wood and oily foam. These were not dramatic claims. That made them more useful. The people giving them were calm, specific, often unsure what the details meant. They were not building a theory. They were simply reporting what did not fit. Investigators took note of one detail above all others. Many witnesses described movement without strong surface waves. In other words, the water looked wrong before it looked dangerous. That can happen when pressure moves through confined channels, culverts, or blocked drainage routes before spreading into open land. By then, the footage, the water lines, and the witness statements were starting to lean in one direction. Something inside the region's water control network may have shifted, stalled, or reversed under stress. And if that was true, the swamp footage was not only showing the aftermath of a storm, it was showing the shape of a system losing control where almost nobody could see it happen. If you value deep investigations like this, consider subscribing. As more crews moved into the swamp, the public updates grew shorter. At first, local agencies released the usual images: boats moving through dark water, roads cut off by flooding, tree limbs piled against bridge rails. Then the flow of detail began to slow. Officials still spoke about recovery, safety, and standing water, but they said less about what was being found deep inside the wetland itself. That silence drew attention. Some responders later described scenes that did not match the early briefings. Not dramatic scenes, more troubling than dramatic. Segments of narrow access paths were gone in ways that looked clean. Not chaotic. Bank edges had collapsed inward. Culvert mouths were blocked by packed vegetation, and debris pressed so tightly together that it looked forced there under pressure. In a few places, water was still moving through the blockage from below, carrying silt into channels that should have been draining out. This suggested a hidden struggle inside the system. When flood control works, water leaves clues on the surface. When flood control breaks in stages, the first clues are often buried in the places nobody watches closely. A blocked gate, a jammed culvert, a channel that cannot release pressure fast enough. Each problem on its own may seem minor, but in flat land, small failures can spread force across miles. One emergency worker reportedly told a local contact that the hardest part was not the damage they could see. It was the damage they suspected had happened underground or under the waterline, where inspection would take days. If true, that changes the story again. It means the swamp footage may have captured only the visible skin of a much larger event. And behind that growing silence sat a harder possibility. Perhaps responders were not withholding some shocking secret. Perhaps they were still trying to understand how many separate failures had happened at once. The most important evidence may not have been inside the flood zone at all. In the days after the storm, crews began reporting damage in places that were not supposed to take that kind of hit. Roads outside the main overflow area showed sudden soft spots beneath the surface. Drainage ditches miles away filled with the same mix of reeds, silt, and broken plant matter seen in the swamp footage. Retention ponds that should have helped reduce pressure instead showed signs of receiving water too fast, or from the wrong direction. This is where the story widened. A storm can flood one area and spare another. That happens often, but when damage appears beyond expected boundaries, investigators start asking a different question. Not where did the water go, but how was it routed? In a managed landscape like Florida's, that question matters more than most people realize. Water rarely moves alone. It moves through design, through canals, pumps, gates, roadside cuts, and old drainage paths built decades ago for a different climate and a smaller population. That design may now be under more pressure than it was ever meant to carry. Some engineers reviewing public images pointed out that even a temporary failure in one part of the network can push stress outward in quiet ways. Soil weakens below roads before the road itself breaks. Water slips into low private land before reaching official gauges. Overflow can enter linked channels that were never expected to carry that load. By the time people notice, the damage is no longer local, and that may explain why the swamp footage felt so unsettling. It did not show a disaster ending at the swamp's edge. It showed a transfer, force moving from the wetland into systems that connect homes, roads, and towns to the land beneath them, which means the real aftermath may not have been what the cameras first saw. It may have been what those cameras could not follow once the water left the swamp. If you value deep investigations like this, consider subscribing. By this stage, the swamp footage was no longer just a record of storm damage. It had become evidence, not proof of one dramatic collapse, but of something more difficult to explain. A wider system under stress, a chain of small failures linking together until the land itself began to show the pattern. Investigators started comparing public maps with the areas where the strangest signs appeared. Again and again, the same overlap returned. Scrape marks near drainage cuts, backflow signs near control points, debris bands where managed channels met open marsh. The deeper they looked, the less random the damage seemed. This is where flood stories become uncomfortable, because storms are easy to blame. They arrive from the sky. They make destruction feel natural, distant, almost unavoidable. But systems built by people are different. They come with plans, budgets, warnings, and limits. If a storm exposes weakness inside that system, then the aftermath is not only about weather. It is also about design, maintenance, and whether old protections still match present risks. Florida's water network is vast, but it is also layered with age. Some channels were cut for farmland. Some barriers were built for neighborhoods that no longer sit alone on the landscape. Population grew. Surfaces changed. Rainfall patterns shifted. Sea levels crept higher. Yet much of the control logic stayed rooted in an earlier Florida. That may be what the swamp revealed so clearly. Not a single shocking event, but a map of stress hidden inside ordinary infrastructure. Pressure meeting old assumptions. Water finding routes the models no longer fully predict. And if that reading is correct, then the footage was never only about what happened after one storm. It was showing what happens when a region enters a new era, while still relying on systems built for the last one. The question now was no longer what the swamp had seen. It was how many other places were waiting to show the same warning. In the end, the strangest thing in the footage was not the damage. It was the message hidden inside the damage. Florida's swamps have always been treated as edges, places between solid ground and open water, places that absorb force so cities do not have to. But that idea depends on one belief staying true, that the systems around them still work as designed, that pumps, gates, canals, and flood maps still match the world they were built to control. The footage suggests that belief may be weakening. What the cameras caught was not just ruin left behind by a storm. It was a landscape showing stress in plain view. Reeds bent by more than wind. Water lines shaped by more than rain. Debris carried by more than simple overflow. Each clue on its own could be dismissed. Together, they form a quieter conclusion. The swamp may have recorded a warning before the official language had words for it. And warnings like this matter because they rarely stay where they begin. A failure in wetland drainage becomes a road problem. A road problem becomes a housing problem. A housing problem becomes an insurance problem. A planning problem. A public trust problem. By the time the pattern is fully visible, it has already moved beyond the swamp. That is why this footage lingers. Not because it shows something impossible, but because it shows something possible and repeatable. A system strained past the point where nature and infrastructure can still be separated cleanly. Florida's swamps are often described as wild. In truth, they are also records. They remember pressure. They remember direction. They remember what the land was forced to carry. And in those first confusing images, they may have remembered the future before anyone else did. If you value deep investigations like this, consider subscribing. What remains now is not only the question of what happened there. It is whether anyone is ready before the next swamp tells the same story.